My name is Claire Whitmore. I never thought a simple melody could burn my world to ashes. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where the world feels muted as though someone had draped a gauzy curtain over reality. Outside, the last of the daylight spilled through the sheer curtains in my office, painting the cream walls with amber streaks. I was bent over my desk finalizing a mood board for a client's kitchen remodel, completely absorbed in debating whether to pair matte brass handles with soft sage cabinetry. And then I heard it. A sound so ordinary, yet it cut through the quiet like a thread weaving itself into my consciousness. Humming. Low, unhurried, almost intimate. At first, I didn't even process it. My husband Michael was always making little noises when he was at home, drumming his fingers on the countertop absent-mindedly, whistling something from an old movie soundtrack, clearing his throat in a way I'd learned to tune out. But this was different. There was a rhythm, a subtle rise and fall. It wasn't random. It wasn't one of his usual snippets from the radio or something from our shared playlist. No, this had shape. The notes lingered, some stretched almost painfully long, others clipped short like words caught in the throat. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I tilted my head toward the open doorway, letting the sound pull me in. The tune was haunting in a way that didn't make sense. I'd never heard it before yet. It made my chest feel tight, as if it carried the weight of a memory I hadn't lived. Michael appeared in the doorway a moment later, still humming. He leaned against the frame casually, but there was a softness to his face I hadn't seen in years. That expression, not exactly happy, not exactly sad, was like watching a stranger wear my husband's skin. "That's pretty," I said, smiling faintly. "What song is that?" He stopped instantly, the way a child does when you've caught them with something they shouldn't have. There was a flicker so fast I might have imagined it of guilt. No, not quite guilt. More like awareness. "Oh, just something I heard somewhere," he said with a shrug that was too rehearsed. "Got stuck in my head. But I know my husband. After 20 years of marriage, I know the way his eyes dart when he's choosing his words carefully. I know the precise rhythm of his speech when he's holding something back." I murmured, watching him. "Well, it's lovely." He stepped forward, kissed the top of my head lightly, a gesture so brief it felt more like a deflection than affection, and walked away, humming no longer. I sat there for a moment, my hands hovering over the keyboard, the project forgotten. My thoughts were loud, now tangled. Why did the sound of that tune feel intrusive? Why did it make me feel like I was on the outside of something, pressing my face to a fogged window? That night, I caught myself humming it as I brushed my teeth. It had embedded itself in me, looping softly in my mind. I didn't even know the words, if there were any, but the melody had that bittersweet quality of something cherished. When I climbed into bed, Michael was already there, lying on his side with his back to me. The bedroom was dark except for the faint spill of light from the hallway. His breathing was steady, but part of me wondered if it was just a little too even, like the rhythm of a practiced sleeper. I lay there in silence, the melody replaying over and over. I tried to imagine where he might have heard it. A cafe. The radio while driving. Some random playlist. But deep down, my instincts whispered something I didn't want to hear. This wasn't just a song stuck in his head. This song meant something to him. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen making coffee, and there it was again, softer this time, almost under his breath. He had his back to me, one hand on the coffee grinder, the other holding his phone. I stepped in quietly, listening. When he noticed me, he stopped again. "Morning," he said, as if nothing had happened. I forced a smile. Morning. I didn't mention the tune. Instead, I poured myself some coffee and sat at the breakfast bar watching him. Every movement of his felt curated, like he was conscious of my presence in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading into nothing. After all, people hum songs all the time, but something about the way he stopped whenever I acknowledged it, the way his expression shifted for just a second made my instincts bristle. That day, while working on a client's living room layout, I realized I'd been sketching to the rhythm of the melody. It was absurd, like the song had its own gravity pulling my thoughts into its orbit. And with every loop, it felt less like a harmless tune and more like a key. A key to a door I hadn't known existed. A door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. But here's the thing about keys. Once you suspect they exist, you can't stop looking for the lock they belong to. And in that moment, I had no idea that this simple haunting melody would lead me straight to the truth I never wanted to hear. The song didn't let me go. It clung to me like the scent of someone else's perfume on your scarf. Faint, persistent, impossible to ignore. Every time I thought I'd shaken it, it returned in some quiet moment. The morning after that first night, I found Michael in the kitchen again, pouring water into the coffee machine. His shoulders were relaxed. His robe loosely tied, the faintest outline of muscle shifting under the fabric as he moved. And there it was, that melody. Quieter than before. Almost like he was humming to himself without realizing. The notes slipped into the air between us, wrapping themselves around me. I froze in the doorway. I wanted to ask about it again, to press harder this time, but something told me not to. Instead, I walked to the counter and reached for a mug. He noticed me immediately and stopped. "Morning," he said, smiling, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning." I returned it, pouring coffee. We made small talk about his upcoming meeting, the weather, the grocery list. But my ears still rang with the absence of those notes, and I caught myself wondering, did he stop because he felt embarrassed? Or because the song wasn't meant for me to hear? Later that day, I had a consultation at a boutique cafe downtown. It was one of those charming little places with exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and mismatched chairs that somehow looked perfectly curated. I arrived early, as I often do. Punctuality is my armor in business and life. I ordered a latte, found a small table near the window, and started flipping through fabric swatches. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and espresso, the low murmur of conversation forming a pleasant background. And then, the song. Not hummed, not fragmented, full, complete, flowing from the cafe speakers in a voice both delicate and aching. I froze mid-reach for a swatch, my hand hovering over the table. My heart gave a single hard thud. It was the same melody Michael had been humming. No question. Each note was a mirror image of the version lodged in my head. But now it had words. And those words, they were love. Not in the generic pop song way, not about roses or moonlight or holding hands. These lyrics were intimate, rooted in personal history. The singer described the curve of someone's smile when they're about to win an argument, the way you leave your coffee half finished because you get lost in telling a story. My stomach turned. I knew those details. They weren't about me. The barista, a young woman with a messy bun and a nose ring, caught me staring up at the speaker. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. I blinked. "Yes." "Who's singing?" "Oh, that's Eliza Hart," she replied, leaning on the counter. "She's a local singer-songwriter. That one's her most popular song. She said she wrote it for someone really special." Special. The word felt sour in my mouth. Yeah. She played here last month and told this story about how the person she wrote it for still hasn't told his wife it's about him. The barista laughed, not unkindly, as though it were some romantic secret. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Really, she said, oblivious to the weight of her words. "Guess she likes the drama." The client arrived a moment later, and I somehow managed to make it through our meeting. I smiled when appropriate, nodded when necessary, even made notes about shelving units and accent rugs, all while my mind screamed. After she left, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. Michael had never mentioned knowing a musician. He certainly never mentioned a song. And yet, there it was. Our lives brushed by it twice in 2 days, in ways that felt anything but random. When I got home, Michael was at his desk typing furiously. He looked up when I entered. "Hey, how'd your meeting go?" "Fine," I said, setting my bag down. "Just the usual design stuff." I didn't tell him about the cafe. Not yet. My mind was already shifting into a mode I knew well, the quiet, deliberate calculation I use when planning a big project. Only now the project wasn't a living room remodel. It was finding out what my husband was hiding. That night, I lay in bed again, eyes open, in the dark. The melody was there, looping in my mind. Only now it had words. And each lyric cut deeper because I understood what they implied. Someone else had pieces of my husband that I didn't. Someone else knew details about him that belonged by rights to me. And the worst part, I wasn't even sure how long it had been going on. I reached for my phone in the dark and typed Eliza Hartsinger into the search bar. Her face appeared instantly, mid-30s, striking in that effortless way that comes from knowing your own appeal. There were photos of her on stage at small venues playing guitar under dim lights, her hair falling in waves over her face. And then I saw it. One picture buried in a carousel from a local gig. The angle was from the crowd, blurry but unmistakable Michael. Sitting near the front, his gaze locked on her, a soft smile playing at his lips. A smile I hadn't seen in years. For the rest of the week, I couldn't unsee that photo. It sat in the back of my mind like a watermark over everything I did: cooking dinner, answering client emails, folding laundry. No matter how mundane the task, Michael's face in that dimly lit venue would flash behind my eyes, watching her the way a man watches someone he's falling for. I told myself I needed more than a picture and a gut feeling. I'd learned the hard way in life, both in business and relationships, that acting without proof could backfire. People could twist your words, gaslight you until you doubted yourself. No, I would wait. I would observe. I would collect. But I didn't have to wait long. The following Thursday, I had a late morning meeting downtown. My last appointment canceled, leaving me with an unexpected free hour before heading home. I wandered into a small side street lined with artisan shops and cafes. One in particular caught my eye, a new place with deep green walls, soft jazz drifting out, and pastries in the window that looked like art. The second I walked in, the air felt thick. Not from the scent of coffee or the warmth of the heaters, but from the sound coming through the speakers. That same song. Eliza Hart's voice, smooth and aching, floated through the space like silk. The lyrics rolled out in gentle waves. You tap your thumb on the table when you're nervous. You look at the floor when you're hiding something. The last line made my skin prickle. I ordered tea and sat at a corner table, phone in hand but screen dark. My ears were tuned entirely to the music. I knew now that every word was deliberate, that this wasn't some vague romantic ode. This was a diary set to melody, and Michael was in every page. When the song ended, the barista, a different young woman than the one from the week before, smiled as she walked past with a tray. "We've been playing her stuff all week. You know Eliza Hart?" I kept my voice casual. "I've heard of her. She's amazing," Liv, the barista said, stopping briefly. "She's performing at the Lakeside Lounge this Saturday. Always sells out quick. People say the guy she wrote that song for sometimes shows up." My grip tightened on my cup. "Really?" "Yeah," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing gossip. "She doesn't name him, but it's kind of obvious to her fans. We all wonder when he's going to leave his wife." The words were delivered so lightly, like it was some thrilling soap opera, not the possible unraveling of my life. I left the cafe with my pulse pounding in my ears. By the time I got home, my decision was made. I was going to see her perform. Not because I wanted to confront her, not yet, but because I needed to know exactly what Michael had entangled himself in. Saturday night, I told Michael I had a late consultation with a client. He nodded absently, eyes glued to his laptop. I watched him for a moment. his hair falling over his forehead, his jaw tightening as he typed. Did he think of her while sitting here? Did the song loop in his mind the way it did in mine? The lakeside lounge was dim cozy with small round tables clustered near the stage. The air smelled of whiskey and cedar, the chatter low but electric. I found a seat in the back, shadowed enough that no one would notice me. When she came on stage, I understood immediately. Eliza Hart had that rare, magnetic presence, not flashy, not forced, but the kind that drew every gaze without asking. She greeted the crowd with a soft smile, adjusted her guitar strap, and began. The first few songs were lovely, harmless even. But then she leaned into the microphone, her voice lowering. This next one is for someone very dear to me. You know who you are. The first chord struck and my chest constricted. His melody filled the room. But it wasn't just the notes. It was the way she sang them, her eyes scanning the crowd like she was searching for someone. The way the lyrics curled around intimate details you leave the porch light on even when you're not home. You say you're not a dancer, but you move when no one's watching. She paused before the final verse, and in that silence I heard the faint clink of a glass. I looked toward the sound, and there he was. Michael. Sitting at a table near the stage, half in shadow, his gaze locked on her like she was the only person in the world. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My nails dug into my palm under the tablecloth, the sharp sting the only thing keeping me from making a scene. When the song ended, the crowd erupted in applause. Eliza's eyes lingered on Michael for a fraction longer before she looked away. I stayed until the set was over, slipping out before the lights came up. In the parking lot, the cold air hit my face like a slap, and for a moment I just stood there gripping my keys, feeling the world tilt. I had seen enough to know the truth. But I also knew this wasn't the moment to explode. This was the moment to plan. The night after the performance, I barely slept. I lay in bed next to Michael, both of us facing opposite walls, the gulf between us wider than the mattress could measure. His breathing was steady even, but I couldn't stop picturing the way his eyes had followed her on stage. That kind of focus wasn't casual. It was hunger. In the faint light from the street lamp outside, I studied the outline of his back. I tried to remember the last time he'd looked at me that way. I couldn't. By morning, my decision was made. I needed more than what I'd seen. I needed proof. The kind that couldn't be denied, twisted, or excused away. That day, while he was in the shower, I went to his dresser, not for his phone just yet, but for the little leather valet tray where he kept loose change, cufflinks, and receipts. It was always a bit of a jumble. I sifted through business cards, old ticket stubs, a hotel room key card with no hotel name. My fingers brushed over a folded paper, and when I opened it, I found a receipt for 2 glasses of wine, a cheese board and dessert at a wine bar across town, dated 3 weeks ago. I'd been at a design expo that night. He'd told me he was working late. I photographed it with my phone, then slid it back exactly where I'd found it. Over the next week, I moved carefully. I didn't change my routine, didn't ask different questions, didn't show my hand. But I started paying attention to the small things, the way his phone was always face down now, how he sometimes left the room to take calls, the faint scent of cologne on his shirt. That wasn't the one he normally wore. I kept a notebook hidden in my office drawer. Each time I noticed something, I wrote it down. Date time, what I saw or heard. It felt clinical, almost businesslike, but it kept my emotions from swallowing me whole. One Thursday afternoon, I was in the car on my way to a client meeting when my phone pinged with a social media notification. A mutual acquaintance had posted photos from a local art gallery opening the night before. As I scrolled through, one image froze me cold, Michael standing in the background near the wine table. Not with me, not with his colleagues, but with her. Eliza Hart. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand lightly brushing his sleeve. My grip on the phone tightened so hard my knuckles ached. I saved the image immediately. That night I didn't confront him. Instead, I let him tell me about his late budget meeting while I nodded and asked how it went. He looked me straight in the eye and lied without blinking. That more than anything made my stomach turn. By now, I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. And anger for me is a dangerous thing. The following Saturday, I told him I was heading to an out-of-town design consult. In reality, I was going to the little wine bar from the receipt I'd found. I wanted to see for myself. The place was cozy, dimly lit with walls lined in dark wood and bottles displayed like art. I took a seat at the bar and ordered a glass of Merlot. The bartender, a man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard, chatted easily. "Haven't seen you here before," he said. "No," I replied. "A friend recommended it. She said she came here with a guy recently. Tall, dark hair, wears a navy peacoat." His brows lifted in recognition. "Oh yeah, I think I know who you mean. Comes in sometimes with a woman brunette singer type. She's got a hell of a voice." I smiled faintly as though I were just making conversation. "Singer? Huh? Yeah," he said, polishing a glass. "They always sit at that corner table." He nodded toward a secluded spot by the window. "Seem pretty close." The word close landed like a stone in my chest. I finished my wine, thanked him, and left the cool night air cutting against my cheeks. Back in my car, I sat in the dark for a long moment, my hands gripping the wheel. Every piece of this puzzle was falling into place: the song, the cafe, the performance, the receipt, the gallery. And now, the confirmation from someone who didn't even know me. The betrayal wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, tangible, undeniable. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, I realized something that startled me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw. But underneath it, there was a strange calm. Because now the power was shifting. I had what I needed. And soon he would know it. Once I had enough fragments of proof to hold in my hand, my next step became clear. I needed to hear the song directly from her. Not through cafe speakers or a scratchy phone recording, but from the woman herself in the same room, so I could study every flicker of expression and every glance she threw into the crowd. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was strategy. Eliza Hart's next show was listed online, a small set at a wine lounge just outside the city. I bought my ticket under a fake name, printed it, and hid it in the lining of my leather planner. Michael thought I was meeting an old college friend for dinner that night. I didn't correct him. When I arrived at the venue, the first thing I noticed was how intimate it felt, no more than 30 tables each, with a single candle glowing in the center. The air was warm with the scent of mulled wine and cedar, the low hum of conversation filling the spaces between clinking glasses. I chose a seat near the back, partially shadowed by a column, but with a clear line of sight to the stage. My heart was steady now, my breathing even. I was no longer the woman wondering if she was imagining things. I was the woman who already knew, simply waiting for confirmation to crystallize into certainty. The lights dimmed. A murmur rippled through the audience as she stepped on stage. Eliza Hart was exactly as she appeared in photos, tall, poised, with an effortless kind of beauty that didn't demand attention so much as invite it. She carried herself like someone who knew she had the room before she even spoke. Her first few songs were pleasant, harmless, full of soft metaphors about rain and sunlight. I listened politely, sipped my wine, kept my expression neutral. Then she paused. "This next one," she said, her voice dropping into a register meant to draw people in, "is for someone who knows exactly who they are. We've been through a lot, and I think you know this one by heart." The opening chord slid into the air and my throat tightened. The melody. Michael's melody. Only it wasn't his, it was hers. Or maybe it was theirs. She sang, and the words felt like tiny scalpels, each slicing a little deeper. "You don't dance, but you sway when the world feels right. You hide your smile when you're losing a fight. You leave the porch light on though you're not home tonight." I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. About halfway through, I saw her eyes scan the crowd, not idly searching, and when they landed on a spot near the bar, her expression shifted. I followed her gaze. Michael. He wasn't close to the stage this time, but far enough back that he probably thought I wouldn't see him. He was leaning against the wall, his coat draped over his arm, a faint smile pulling at his mouth. It was the smile of someone who knows they're being sung to. My fingers curled around my wine glass. The stem was cool under my skin, grounding me. Every instinct screamed to march over there to let my voice cut through the music and tear away the comfortable fantasy he was living in. But I didn't. I stayed in my seat, my face unreadable. Because the truth was, his being here was exactly what I wanted. Every move he made, every look they exchanged was another piece of evidence. When the song ended, the crowd applauded and Eliza gave a small nod in his direction, almost imperceptible, unless you were looking for it. I was looking. The rest of the set passed in a blur. I didn't remember the other songs, only the way she seemed lighter after singing that one, the way Michael slipped out before the final encore, as if not to be noticed. I waited until the lights came up, until the audience had thinned, and then I left my heels clicking softly against the pavement. Driving home, I kept replaying the evening in my mind. I now had first-hand confirmation not only was the song about him, but they were still actively in contact, still meeting, still wrapped in whatever this thing was between them. When I pulled into the driveway, Michael's car wasn't there. He came home 40 minutes later, smelling faintly of wine and wood smoke. "How was your dinner?" he asked, hanging his coat. I met his eyes, steady and calm. "Lovely. Yours?" He hesitated just a fraction. "Quiet night in." I smiled faintly and went back to rinsing a glass in the sink. Inside, the anger was still there, but it was tempered now by something sharper resolve. I wasn't going to explode in a fit of rage. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking he'd caught me off guard. No, I was going to let him keep believing I was in the dark even as I turned on every light around him, because I knew now that betrayal like a song has a rhythm. And if you learn it well enough, you can make it dance to your tune. I'd told myself I wasn't going to stalk him, that if I had enough self-respect I wouldn't sink to trailing my own husband through the city like some desperate shadow. But betrayal does something to you. It rewires your instincts, makes you sharper, quieter, more dangerous. A week after Eliza's wine lounge performance, Michael told me over breakfast that he had an early meeting with a supplier. He was in his navy pea coat, the one he wears when he wants to look just a little more polished. I remember the way he stood by the counter sipping coffee without looking at me, and how quickly he rinsed the mug before setting it in the sink. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I knew a lie when I saw one. From the front window, I watched him pull out of the driveway. Instead of opening my laptop to start on the master bedroom renovation I'd planned for a client, I just sat there with my coffee, the steam curling upward like a slow, deliberate signal. Something in me whispered, "Go." I didn't rush. I showered, dressed in dark jeans and a camel coat, and left the house 30 minutes later, just enough time for him to have reached wherever he was going. By then I had learned his patterns. Michael doesn't like crowded breakfast places. He prefers quiet cafes, the kind with wood paneling and low music where you can have a conversation without raising your voice. And he almost never parks directly outside. He hates the risk of dings from passing cars. It took me less than 15 minutes to find his vehicle. It was parked 2 blocks from a cafe I didn't recognize, tucked between a bookshop and a florist. Dark green awnings, frosted windows, the name painted in gold script above the door, Haven House Cafe. I parked a few cars down and cut the engine, my pulse even, but my senses sharp. Through the wide front window, I could see him. He wasn't alone. Eliza sat across from him in a corner booth, her hair loose over her shoulders, a cup of tea cradled between her hands. The late morning light caught on the edge of her face, making her look almost unreal, the kind of moment photographers chase. Michael was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, his phone turned face down beside his coffee. He smiled at something she said, that slow, easy smile I hadn't seen aimed at me in years. For a moment, I just sat in my car, letting the image imprint itself into my mind. I wanted the full truth, not just the silent film from behind glass. So I got out and crossed the street, boots clicking softly against the pavement. The bell above the door gave a delicate chime as I stepped inside. The air was warm, scented faintly with cinnamon and roasted beans. They were tucked deep enough into their corner that they didn't see me. I let my gaze sweep the cafe in a casual arc before moving toward a display of preserves and small batch honey near their table. The jars were arranged in neat rows on tall wooden shelves. From where I stood, I could see the reflection of their faces in the window. I kept my head angled toward the jars, pretending to read labels, my ears straining to catch their voices over the low background chatter. "Haven't told her yet," Eliza was saying. Her voice was low but firm, threaded with something between impatience and concern. "I will," Michael replied, his tone almost defensive. "It's just not the right time." She leaned forward slightly. "You've been saying that for months, Michael." His hand curled around his coffee cup. "She's been distant lately. If she finds out now, she'll what?" Eliza's voice softened, but her words were sharp. "Be upset. She already knows something's wrong." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the clink of his spoon against the saucer. "I don't want to hurt her," he said finally. I almost laughed out loud, a dry, humorless sound that would have given me away. He said it like a man trying to convince himself the floor wasn't already falling away beneath him. They shifted into small talk after that. Her upcoming set at some vineyard, his busy season at work, the possibility of next month being easier. I didn't understand every reference, but I understood the rhythm. These weren't the conversations of people at the beginning of something reckless. They were comfortable, established. They spoke like two people who'd built a small private world together and were deciding how or if to let the rest of the world see it. Then came the part that made my chest tighten. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. He didn't move away. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. I'd seen enough. I stepped quietly toward the door, pushing it open just enough for the bell to chime again, though not loud enough to draw attention. Outside, the cold air slapped my cheeks, crisp and bracing. I walked back to my car with deliberate steps, slid inside, and sat there gripping the wheel. My breath didn't come fast. My hands didn't shake. The hurt was there, raw and sharp, but underneath it was something steadier. A current of focus. This was no longer suspicion. This was proof. Not in legal terms maybe, but in the court of my own mind, this was the smoking gun. I had seen his face as he looked at her, heard his voice, as he promised her something he never intended to tell me. On the drive home, I thought about how carefully he must have planned all this. The early mornings, the meetings, the shows he slipped out to see. How sure he must have been that I was too trusting, too distracted with my work and our routines to notice. The thing about betrayers is that they get sloppy. Comfort makes them careless, and I'd been counting on that. When I got home, I didn't confront him. Not yet. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and updated the small notebook I kept hidden in my office drawer. Date, time, location, summary of what I'd seen and heard. My notes read almost like an investigator's report. That was intentional, because if there's one thing I'd learned in both design and in life, it's that preparation is everything. You don't start tearing down walls until you know exactly where the beams are. Michael came home just after 2. His coat smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sweet. Maybe her perfume carried on the air of that cafe. He kissed my temple in greeting, asked how my day was. "Productive," I said, with a small smile. I didn't ask about his meeting. I didn't ask who he'd seen. The silence was its own kind of trap, one he didn't even realize he was walking into. That night, as I lay beside him in the dark, I realized I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. Because now I had it. and soon I was going to use it. Once I'd seen them together in that cafe, the uncertainty that had gnawed at me for weeks was gone. There's a strange calm that comes when you finally stop wondering and start knowing. My heartbeat didn't spike every time his phone buzzed anymore. I didn't feel the need to invent excuses for the late nights or early mornings. I didn't search for reassurance in his eyes. Instead, I started planning. For years, Michael had underestimated me. He saw the way I ran my interior design business with precision, how I managed budgets, vendors, and deadlines without a single project falling apart. Yet he assumed that same meticulousness didn't extend to our marriage. He thought of me as soft, predictable. The kind of woman who, if confronted with betrayal, would either collapse or look away. He didn't realize I could play the long game. The morning after the cafe, I moved the small notebook from my office drawer to a locked compartment in my desk. It wasn't just for notes anymore, it became an archive. I started printing everything: the gallery photo of him with Eliza, the wine bar receipt, screenshots of her performance schedules that lined up perfectly with his meetings or late work nights. I went back to that wine bar too, this time in the late afternoon when the staff were slow and chatty. I ordered a drink, then casually asked the bartender if the woman with the guitar had played there again recently. He smiled and said, "Yeah, she's a regular. Usually comes in with a tall guy, dark hair. Seems like they're a thing." I nodded like it was just idle curiosity, but I knew exactly how valuable his casual remark would be later. I also started checking our joint credit card statements daily. The online log gave me exact timestamps and merchant names. Twice in 1 week there were charges for venues and restaurants that matched places Eliza had posted about on social media. I took screenshots of everything. Michael didn't notice the change in me, or maybe he noticed and mistook it for something else. I was quieter, yes, but not cold. I still asked about his day, still cooked dinner, still kissed him on the cheek in the mornings. If anything, I was more accommodating. Let him think the distance between us was closing. One Friday night while he was in the shower, I took his phone off the nightstand. I wasn't looking for messages. I'd already prepared myself for what I might find, but for call logs. There they were, a string of late-night calls to an unsaved number. Cross-referencing with a reverse lookup confirmed it belonged to a booking agent for live music venues. Eliza's booking agent. I wrote it down, printed the lookup page, and slid it into my folder. By now the evidence was a tapestry. Every thread wove into the next: the song, the performances, the photographs, the receipts, the eyewitness accounts. I wasn't building this for my own satisfaction. I was building it so when the confrontation came, there would be no room for doubt, no possibility of him twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. The last thing I needed was the right moment to strike, and strangely, it came from someone unexpected. A mutual friend, Lydia, called me out of the blue on a Tuesday afternoon. She said she'd been at a private party over the weekend where Eliza was performing. "I think I saw Michael there," she said carefully. I wasn't sure if I should even bring it up. Why, I asked, my voice neutral. Because he wasn't alone. He was with her the whole night, Claire. They weren't inappropriate exactly, but you could feel it. The way they stood close, the way they looked at each other, it was obvious to anyone paying attention. I thanked her, my tone steady, and made a note in my book, Lydia Witness. That night, I didn't mention her call to Michael. I didn't have to. Because as I sat across from him at dinner watching him talk about his day, I realized something that made me almost smile. He thought he was playing me, but I was the one setting the rules now. I decided that the next phase wasn't about gathering evidence. It was about arranging the stage for the reveal. And if I was going to do this, it wouldn't be in the privacy of our living room where he could downplay or dismiss me. It would be in a place where the truth would land with the kind of weight he couldn't escape. The opportunity came in the form of the annual charity gala I helped organize every year for a local arts foundation. Eliza had been gaining traction in the music scene, and the committee had been looking for a performer who could draw in a younger crowd. I didn't just suggest her name, I personally reached out to her booking agent, disguising my voice slightly and using only my first name. The arrangements were set within days. Michael didn't know she would be performing. When the night came, I would be ready. And so would my folder. The charity gala had always been one of my proudest projects, a carefully orchestrated evening that blended elegance with purpose. For years, I'd coordinated everything from the guest list to the centerpieces, ensuring it was the kind of event people looked forward to all year. This year, it was going to serve another purpose. It wasn't just a fundraiser anymore. It was a stage. By the time the night arrived, the plan was flawless. I had Eliza booked for a 30-minute set in the second half of the evening, just after the main auction, the point when the room would be buzzing, the lights dimmed, and all eyes on the stage. The seating chart placed Michael and me at a table near the center, just close enough to have a clear view, but far enough that she wouldn't be able to miss us in the crowd. I wore a deep emerald gown, my hair in a sleek chignon, makeup polished but not severe. Everything about my appearance that night was intentional. I wanted to look unshakable. Michael looked sharp in his charcoal suit, oblivious to the fact that the woman he'd been seeing behind my back was in the building. He kissed my cheek as we entered the ballroom, his hand resting lightly on my back. If he noticed my steady gaze sweeping the room, he said nothing. The evening began as it always did. Cocktails, polite conversation, the low clink of champagne glasses. I mingled with guests, my smile warm, but my mind focused on the next few hours. Every now and then, I caught Michael glancing at his phone under the table, and I wondered if he knew Eliza was in town that night. When the auction ended, the MC took the microphone and announced a special musical guest. As the lights shifted to a soft amber glow, the stage curtains parted and Eliza stepped into view, guitar in hand. I felt the smallest flicker of satisfaction when I saw the look on Michael's face. Surprise first, then something else. Recognition laced with a sharp awareness. His fingers tightened around his champagne flute, and he sat up straighter as if trying to decide how to react without giving himself away. Eliza greeted the audience with a gracious smile. "It's such an honor to be here tonight," she said. "This first song is very close to my heart." I knew what was coming before the first chord struck. The melody filled the room, the one I had first heard hummed absent-mindedly in my own home. The one that had followed me into cafes, onto social media feeds, into dimly lit lounges. But now it was amplified, rich and clear, carrying over the silent crowd. Her voice wove through the lyrics like silk, each line drawing a thread straight to Michael. "You don't dance, but you sway when the world feels right. You hide your smile when you're losing a fight. You leave the porch light on, though you're not home tonight." The spotlight swept gently across the audience, pausing briefly on our table. I watched her eyes flicker in our direction, a pause so brief anyone else might have missed it. I didn't miss it. Neither did Michael. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened on certain lines. Around us, people murmured softly, as if sensing that the performance was personal. When the song ended, the applause was polite, but warm. Eliza dipped her head, offered a small thank you, and moved into her next number, something more upbeat, less intimate. But the damage was already done. The connection had been drawn in the minds of more than a few people in that room. As she sang, I let my gaze drift across the tables. I caught Lydia's eye, the same friend who had seen them together at that private party, and she gave me the faintest nod as if to say she saw exactly what I had orchestrated. The rest of the set passed without incident, but every time Michael shifted beside me, I could sense the storm building under his polished exterior. He was trapped in a room full of witnesses, unable to leave without drawing attention, forced to sit through the performance like any other guest. When it was over, the applause rose again, and Eliza left the stage. The MC returned to thank her, and the evening flowed into dessert service. I sipped my coffee, my expression serene, while Michael barely touched his plate. He made an effort at conversation with the other guests, but his responses were clipped, distracted. As we left the ballroom later that night, his hand on my back felt heavier, almost like an anchor. In the car, the silence stretched until he finally said, "You knew she'd be here." I kept my eyes on the road ahead. "Of course. I'm on the planning committee." He didn't respond, but I could feel his stare. I didn't give him more. Not yet. The reveal wasn't for the car ride home. It wasn't even for that night. No. The gala was just the overture. The symphony was still to come. After the gala, the air between Michael and me changed subtly at first, then with an unmistakable heaviness. He didn't say much in the days that followed. Not about Eliza, not about the performance, not about the fact that I'd sat there watching him hear his song in a room full of people. But his silence wasn't the kind that comes from peace. It was watchful, measured. He was waiting for me to bring it up. I didn't. Instead, I moved through our home like nothing had shifted. I cooked dinner, answered client calls, watered the plants. I asked about his day with the same calm tone I'd always used. If anything, I was gentler, quieter, and I could see that it unnerved him. Because Michael was used to two kinds of Claire, the engaged, talkative wife, who noticed every detail, and the openly upset one when something bothered me. This third version, the serene, impenetrable Claire, didn't fit his playbook. He began to study me the way I had studied him for weeks. I'd catch him watching me over his coffee cup, his brow faintly furrowed. Once I walked into the kitchen to find him standing by the sink, phone in hand, as if he'd been mid-text before hearing my footsteps. "Everything okay?" I asked lightly. He slipped the phone into his pocket. "Yeah, just work." I smiled and went to pour myself some water as if the explanation satisfied me. Inside, I could feel the power tilting further in my direction. A silent Cold War had begun, and I was the one dictating its terms. The strategy was simple: keep him guessing. Let him think I might know something but never confirm it. Create just enough uncertainty that he'd start making mistakes. And he did. One evening, he mentioned a late meeting with a client. He left in a rush suit jacket over his arm. Half an hour later, I saw on social media that Eliza was performing at a wine bar across town. I didn't follow her publicly. I used a secondary account with no trace back to me, but I kept the post screenshotting the timestamp. That same night, he came home smelling faintly of red wine and sandalwood. His tie loosened his eyes, avoiding mine. I asked how the meeting went. "Fine," he said, reaching for the fridge. The next morning, I casually mentioned I'd heard the wine bar had live music the night before. "Really?" he said, not looking up from his coffee. His voice was neutral, but his hand gripped the mug a fraction tighter. I didn't press. I didn't need to. Every exchange was like this, a dance where he didn't know the steps anymore. I could see the doubt creeping in, the way he seemed to study my tone, my expressions, trying to decide whether I was suspicious or oblivious. What he didn't know was that I had already gathered everything I needed. The notebook in my desk was now a thick binder neatly labeled dates, locations, receipts, screenshots, and notes from conversations I'd overheard. If I wanted, I could have handed it to a lawyer tomorrow and watched his world implode. But I wasn't ready for the final act yet. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own lies pressing down on him, to live in the space between knowing and being found out. One Saturday morning, I left the binder open on my desk while I went to make tea. Not wide open, not enough for him to see specifics, just enough that if he passed by, he might catch the edge of a receipt or the corner of a printed photo. When I returned, the chair had been moved slightly. The binder sat exactly as I'd left it, but there was a faint disturbance in the pages, like someone had brushed them with their fingertips. Michael didn't mention it, but that night he was quieter than usual, almost careful with his words. Good. Let him wonder. The truth is, I wasn't just waiting for the right moment to confront him, I was letting him build his own prison. The more he thought about what I might know, the more he'd watch himself hesitate, overcompensate. Because the confrontation I was planning wasn't going to be a messy emotional explosion in our living room, it was going to be precise, calculated. I was going to walk into it holding every card, knowing exactly how the game would end before I played the first move. And by the time I finally looked him in the eye and told him I knew, he'd already have broken himself down with the waiting. I thought I had everything I needed. The binder in my office was now thick enough to require a clasp to keep it closed, its pages heavy with dates, receipts, photographs, screenshots, and observations. Each page was like a tile in a mosaic, and together they formed the image I'd been avoiding, the shape of my husband's betrayal. I'd told myself I was finished collecting, that I had enough to confront him whenever I decided. But then came the call. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of those strangely quiet days where the world outside seemed muted. I was on my office floor arranging swatches for a client's master bedroom redesign when my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed Daniel Carter. Daniel, an old friend, or perhaps more accurately, a friend of a friend. We'd known each other socially for years through mutual acquaintances and charity events. He and his wife Melissa had moved several states away about 5 years ago, but we still exchanged the occasional email or holiday card. It had been well over a year since we'd last spoken. I answered, curious. Daniel. What a surprise. How are you two? His voice was warm, but there was an edge to it. We're doing well. Melissa sends her love. Claire. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all, I said, pushing aside the swatches. What's going on? He hesitated. Just a beat, but enough to make me sit up straighter. I've been debating whether to call you, he said finally. Melissa told me I'd regret it if I didn't. A faint chill traced the back of my neck. Call me about what you remember, that singer from the gala, he asked. Eliza Hart. I kept my tone neutral. Yes, I remember her. I was in town this past weekend, he said slowly. Melissa was visiting friends, so I had dinner with my sister. We went to that little place downtown, Bistro 14. While we were there, I saw her. My pulse was steady, but my breath came just a fraction slower. You saw Eliza? Yes, he said, and she wasn't alone. She was with Michael. The world didn't tilt. It didn't shatter. It simply confirmed itself. They were sitting in a booth, Daniel continued, near the back. They had a bottle of wine between them. Laughing, leaning in close. And, I don't know how to say this gently, they kissed. Not a quick kiss either. The kind you give someone well, you're involved with. There was no point in pretending to be shocked. I see, I said quietly. I'm sorry, Claire, he said. I didn't want to hurt you, but I also didn't want to look back and know I'd stayed silent. If it were me? His voice trailed off, but I understood. You did the right thing, I told him. And you don't need to apologize. I appreciate your honesty. We spoke for a few minutes longer, touching briefly on safer topics: Melissa's work, his sister's engagement, but the undercurrent was there, strong and unavoidable. When I hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the phone still in my hand. Daniel hadn't told me anything I didn't already suspect. But he had given me something far more valuable than suspicion: independent, credible testimony from a source with no personal bias. This wasn't a stranger at a bar or an employee at a cafe. This was someone who knew us both, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by getting involved, and he had chosen to step forward anyway. It was, in legal terms, the kind of evidence that shifts a case from circumstantial to undeniable. That evening, Michael came home later than usual. He didn't greet me right away, just set down his briefcase and hung his coat with practiced ease. I watched from the kitchen doorway, wine glass in hand, as he poured himself a drink. How was your day? I asked lightly. He gave me a half smile. Busy. Traffic was terrible on the way back. I took a slow sip of my wine. Daniel called me today. His expression didn't change much, just a flicker in his eyes so quick most people would have missed it. But I caught it. "Daniel," he repeated. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice even. "He's in town visiting his sister. Ran into someone we both know." I let the words hang there, weightless but sharp. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to, and his choice not to ask told me everything. He was already imagining the answer. We ate dinner in near silence. He asked about a client project. I asked about his schedule for the week. It was the kind of surface-level conversation two strangers might have at a bus stop, polite, but void of depth. Later, when he went upstairs to shower, I walked into my office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out the binder. I opened it to a fresh page and wrote in neat block letters, "Witness Daniel Carter, date. Specific date. Location Bistro, 14 Downtown Observation. Michael and Eliza Hart seated together. Shared wine, intimate behavior, prolonged kiss." I slid the page into a plastic sleeve and closed the binder, the clasp clicking shut with satisfying finality. This was no longer just a collection of things I'd noticed or places he'd been. It was now a documented record, airtight, irrefutable, and complete. And for the first time since I'd heard that melody in our home office weeks ago, I felt something close to relief. Until now, a small part of me, the part conditioned by years of marriage and moments of doubt, had clung to the possibility that I might be wrong. That maybe the song was just a song, the cafe meetings innocent, the lingering glances coincidental. But that part of me was gone now. What Daniel had given me wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was the final lock on a door I had already begun to close. There was no turning the handle anymore. When I went upstairs later, Michael was already in bed, lying on his side with his back to me. I slipped under the covers without a word. The quiet between us was thick, but I didn't mind it anymore, because the confrontation was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. And I would be the one to decide the moment, the place, and the terms. Once Daniel's testimony went into the binder, something inside me shifted. The hunt for evidence was over. I no longer needed to watch him out of the corner of my eye or quietly cross-reference his lies with receipts. I had everything. Now came the part I'd been preparing for without fully admitting it to myself, the confrontation. But not the kind he would expect. Michael would probably imagine a cornered, trembling wife blurting accusations in the middle of a heated argument. He'd be ready for shouting tears, demands for explanations. He'd have his denials rehearsed, his counterattacks polished, the gaslighter's survival kit. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of using any of it. No, I wanted to control every variable, the location, the timing, even the emotional temperature of the room. I wanted him to walk in thinking he was on solid ground and realize too late that the floor had been pulled out from under him. I thought about the where and when for days. At home would give him too many escape routes, literally and figuratively. A public setting risked making me look like the unhinged one if emotions ran high. I needed somewhere private enough for me to speak freely, but contained enough that he couldn't just walk away. The answer came to me one night while I was soaking in the bath, steam curling around the edges of my thoughts, his study. Michael loved that room, the heavy oak desk, the leather chair, the shelves lined with books he rarely read but liked to display. It was his sanctuary. If I called him in there, he'd assume it was for something serious, but contained maybe even financial, the one area where he still believed we worked as a team. I chose a Friday evening. He'd be home tired from the week, likely with his guard lowered. In the days leading up to it, I played my part flawlessly. I made his favorite meals, left small compliments in conversation, even suggested a movie night. If he was suspicious of my sudden softness, he didn't show it. On the morning of the chosen day, I laid out the binder on the desk in his study, but kept it closed. Just its presence there, centered like a formal dossier, would send a message before I spoke a word. I also made sure to include a manila envelope beside it. Inside were a few of the most undeniable pieces: the gallery photo, the wine bar receipt, the screenshot of Eliza's show coinciding with his late meeting, and, most damning of all, the written account from Daniel. Each page was labeled and dated in bold print. All day as I went through my work, I felt an odd calmness settle over me. This wasn't dread. It was the quiet before a performance I knew I was prepared for. When Michael came home that evening, I greeted him with a glass of his preferred scotch. "Can we talk in your study for a few minutes before dinner?" I asked, my tone light. He frowned slightly, maybe wondering if it was about bills or taxes, but nodded. I walked ahead of him, letting him see the binder and the envelope waiting on the desk. I didn't sit right away. Instead, I stood by the window looking out at the fading light until he closed the door behind us. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing to the desk. I turned to face him, my voice steady. "This," I said, "is the truth. Every piece of it in order with dates, witnesses, and receipts." His brow furrowed. "Claire." I lifted a hand, silencing him before he could launch into whatever script he'd prepared. "You've had weeks, maybe months to tell me. You had the chance at the gala. You had the chance when Daniel saw you at Bistro 14. You had the chance the first night I heard you humming her song in our house." The flicker of recognition in his eyes was all the confirmation I needed. "I don't want to hear that you're sorry. I don't want explanations about how it just happened or how it didn't mean anything. What I want," I moved closer now, setting my palms on the closed binder, "is for you to understand that I know everything. And I've chosen the exact moment to tell you because now there's nothing you can do to rewrite it." He opened his mouth, closed it again. I could see the shift, the realization that he wasn't walking into an argument, but into a verdict. "You've been careful," I continued. "I'll give you that. Careful enough to convince yourself you were smarter than me. But here's the thing, Michael. You forgot who I am. You forgot that I notice every detail. That I can be silent longer than most people can stand just to watch how they move when they think they're unseen." He glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice low. That was the question I'd been waiting for. "I want you out," I said. "I've already contacted a lawyer. The accounts have been secured. The house will be mine. You can collect your things this weekend." He stared at me, the silence stretching between us. I didn't flinch. When he finally spoke, there was no outrage, no denial, just a thin, bitter resignation. "So that's it. That's it," I said. "You've been living in your song, Michael. Time to face the final verse." I stepped aside so he could leave the room. He didn't touch the binder or the envelope. But I knew he'd come back later when I wasn't there to look through every page, because if there was one thing more unbearable than being caught, it was knowing exactly how thoroughly you'd been watched. And that knowledge was part of the punishment. After our confrontation in his study, Michael moved through the house like a ghost. He didn't storm out. He didn't yell. He didn't even try to plead his case. But there was a tautness in the air, like a wire stretched too tight, vibrating with every step he took. I could feel him calculating, weighing his options. That was fine. I'd already calculated for both of us. I'd told him to collect his things by the weekend. That left me with 48 hours to make sure the truth didn't just end within these walls. Because men like Michael thrive in silence. If the only witness to their betrayal is the betrayed, they can retell the story however they want, paint themselves as the victim, the misunderstood, the wronged party. I had no intention of letting him do that. The charity gala had been my first public move, a subtle signal to those who knew how to read it. But subtle wasn't enough anymore. I wanted it to be known in a way that didn't require me to scream it from a rooftop. I wanted it to spread like a whispered rumor, undeniable, untraceable back to me, yet impossible to ignore. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. Lydia, the same friend who had seen Michael and Eliza together at that private party, called to thank me for helping her daughter get an internship with one of my design contacts. We chatted for a while, and then she asked carefully, How are you doing, Claire? I've heard things. There it was. The door opening just a crack. I'm fine, I said evenly. In fact, I'm better than fine. Do you remember the gala? She hesitated. Of course. You remember the song she sang? A pause. Yes. I didn't need to say more. The implication was enough. Lydia wasn't the type to start a wildfire, but she was the type to strike a match and hand it to someone else. That night, I sent an email to the gala's planning committee thanking everyone for their hard work and praising the emotional resonance of the musical performance. I made sure to include one particular sentence. It's rare for a song to feel so personal, especially when the inspiration is sitting in the audience. I knew exactly how quickly that would circulate. Committees are breeding grounds for gossip, and I'd just handed them a story ripe for speculation. 2 days later, I overheard one of Michael's acquaintances at the market telling another woman in hushed tones, apparently that song at the gala, it was about him. And she's married. Perfect. I didn't need to ruin his reputation outright, just nudge the first domino and let gravity handle the rest. By the time he left the house with his suitcase on Sunday afternoon, the current was already pulling against him. His phone had been buzzing more than usual that morning. I didn't ask who it was, but I could guess. As he stood in the foyer, suitcase at his feet, he looked at me like he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an accusation. I gave him nothing. Goodbye, Michael, I said, holding the door open. He stepped out to the winter air rushing in around him. You know this isn't over, he said quietly. It is for me, I replied and closed the door. That night, I opened the binder one last time. I flipped through each page, remembering the way the evidence had come together like pieces of an intricate design. It struck me that this binder wasn't just a record of his lies, it was proof of my own clarity. The moment I heard that melody, something deep inside me had already known. Now everyone who mattered would know too. And that more than anything was my version of closure. The first time I saw him after he left, it was almost by accident. Almost. 2 weeks had passed since he'd rolled his suitcase out of our house. In that time, the whispers had taken root and spread exactly as I'd intended. Lydia hadn't said much to me directly, but I'd heard from two separate friends that people were talking about the gala performance, about the woman who sang a song for a married man, and about the wife who sat in the audience smiling faintly as the spotlight passed over them both. The story was growing legs, and I wasn't the one feeding it anymore. That was the beauty of gossip once set free. It moved on its own. It was a Thursday evening when I walked into the same boutique cafe where I'd first heard Eliza's song playing over the speakers. I'd been working on a project for a client nearby and stopped in for a cappuccino. And there he was. Michael sat at a corner table, hunched slightly, scrolling through his phone. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way people do when the edges of their confidence have been chipped away. There was a tension around his mouth, a faint crease between his brows. I could have walked past, could have ignored him completely, but instead I ordered my coffee, and when it was ready, carried it straight to his table. He looked up, startled. Claire. Michael. I sat down without asking, setting my cup on the table. How's life on the outside? His jaw tightened. You've been talking. I tilted my head. Have I? You know damn well what I mean, he said, his voice low. The calls, the messages. People are looking at me differently. My clients are realizing you're not the man you pretended to be. I finished for him. My tone calm. That's not my fault, Michael. That's the natural consequence of living two lives and thinking no one would notice. His eyes narrowed. You wanted to humiliate me. No, I said. I wanted the truth to be known. If that humiliates you, then maybe the problem isn't me. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. You've always had this way of making people think you're above it all, even when you're twisting the knife. I sipped my cappuccino, meeting his gaze evenly. I don't need to twist the knife. You did that yourself. I just made sure people saw the wound. For a moment, we sat in silence, the low murmur of the cafe filling the space between us. I could feel him wanting to ask why I hadn't confronted him sooner, why I hadn't just ended it quietly. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of explaining my strategy. Instead, I stood gathering my cup. "Enjoy your coffee, Michael." And the song. I hear it's still popular in certain circles. He didn't reply, and I didn't look back as I left. Walking out into the cool evening air, I felt lighter. That wasn't the final conversation we'd have, but it was the first where the power was entirely in my hands, and he knew it. Because now he wasn't just a man who'd been caught. He was a man who couldn't control the story anymore. And for someone like Michael, that was worse than any private argument could ever be. By the time spring thawed the frost from our lawn, Michael's world was already shrinking. I didn't have to dig for updates, they came to me. A colleague from the gala committee mentioned in passing that he'd been conspicuously absent from several industry events. Lydia told me she'd heard from a mutual friend that Eliza's gigs were drawing smaller crowds now that her inspiration had become common knowledge. The truth had a way of making itself unwelcome in polite company. Meanwhile, my own days were full. I threw myself into work, booked new clients, and even took a weekend trip with a few girlfriends. But beneath the surface, I was working on the final piece of my plan, the divorce settlement. I'd already retained a lawyer months ago, quietly, discreetly, before I ever confronted Michael. I'd given her the binder, every page meticulously labeled. She had looked at me over the rim of her glasses and said, "You've done half my work for me." The goal wasn't just to end the marriage, it was to ensure he had nothing to leverage against me financially, socially, or emotionally. We filed the papers with strategic timing, sending them to the address he'd been staying at since leaving the house. The packet was thick, the terms clear. The house was mine. The majority of the joint savings remained with me, and he would walk away without a claim on my business or its assets. My lawyer's argument was airtight, based on my independent income, my contributions to his career, and thanks to the binder proof of conduct that would make contesting the settlement a public relations nightmare for him. When the day came to meet and finalize, we chose a neutral location, a sleek conference room in my lawyer's office with glass walls that let in the early spring sunlight. Michael arrived with his own attorney, looking leaner, a little worn around the edges. He didn't meet my eyes at first. We went through the motion signatures initials, the shuffle of papers sliding across the polished table. It was almost mechanical. But when the final document was signed, he finally looked up at me. "You've been planning this for a long time," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. "Yes," I replied simply. "Since the first night I heard you humming her song." His jaw flexed. "You could have just left quietly." "I could have," I agreed. "But you didn't betray me quietly, Michael. You did it in melodies and glances and public rooms where you thought I wasn't looking. I simply made sure the ending matched the performance." His attorney began packing up, sensing that nothing productive would come from this exchange. Michael lingered a moment longer, his gaze on me sharp but unreadable. Then he stood, sliding his chair back with a controlled scrape. As he left, I realized that this was the last time I would see him in any setting that mattered. From here on, he would be a footnote, a name that once filled the margins of my life, but no longer dictated its story. That night, I walked through my house barefoot, letting the quiet settle around me. The binder sat on my desk upstairs, its purpose fulfilled. I considered shredding it, but decided to keep it tucked away. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder I could trust my instincts. I could hold my silence until it served me. And I could finish what I started. By the time I turned off the lights and went to bed, I wasn't thinking about Michael or Eliza or the song that had started it all. I was thinking about the next chapter. Because now the music was mine again. The first morning I woke up alone in the house, the quiet felt strange. Not heavy, not lonely, just different. The sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains, spilling across the hardwood floor in soft gold. I lay there for a while listening to the stillness. No footsteps in the hallway. No faint hum of a song drifting from another room. Just my own breathing and the distant murmur of the world outside. For the first time in months, I wasn't listening for clues. I wasn't bracing myself for another lie disguised as small talk. I made coffee and took it out to the back patio where the garden was just starting to push through the soil. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of new growth. I sat there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and thought about how everything had begun. A melody. That was all it took. A tune hummed in passing that didn't belong to me. At first, I thought it was nothing more than an unfamiliar song, but deep down, I'd recognized it for what it was: an intrusion. A thread pulled from a fabric I thought was whole. Looking back, I realized that my life hadn't been ripped apart in one sudden motion. It had been unraveling slowly, one stitch at a time, until that song made me see the loose threads for what they were. People often ask, either out loud or in the pauses between words, why I didn't just confront him right away, why I let it go on for weeks, why I stayed silent when I could have shouted. The answer is simple: because the truth is only useful if you can prove it. And because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. If I'd confronted Michael the night I first heard him humming, he would have denied it. He would have turned the questions back on me, made me doubt my own instincts. I'd seen him do it to others. And maybe if I'd caught him off guard with my anger, I would have ended up being the one painted as unstable, jealous, unreasonable. But by waiting, by collecting every detail, every scrap of evidence, I took away his one weapon: the ability to twist the story. That's what the binder really was. Not just proof for me, but protection against him. And when the time came, I didn't just confront him. I dismantled him piece by piece with nothing more than the truth. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that took satisfaction in how it all unfolded. Not just in the settlement or the whispers that followed him, but in knowing I had controlled the ending. He had started the song, but I had decided the final verse. In the weeks since he left, I've thought about Eliza more than I expected to. Not with rage, but with a kind of detached curiosity. Did she know when she first wrote those lyrics how far the ripples would spread? Did she ever imagine they'd lead to this? I don't hate her. If anything, I'm grateful. She gave me the clue I needed, even if it wasn't her intention. Without that song, maybe it would have taken me months, even years, to see the truth. And as much as I hate to admit it, there's a part of me that respects the clarity it brought. Now the house feels lighter, not because it's empty of him, but because it's full of me. My life no longer bends itself around someone else's secrets. I can walk through each room without wondering what's being hidden in the shadows. Sometimes when I'm working in my office, I catch myself humming. Not that song, never that song, but something light, something of my own. It's a small thing, but it feels like reclaiming space, like putting my name back on the music in my own home. If there's anything I've learned, it's this: trust the small things. The offhand comment. The unfamiliar scent. The song that doesn't belong. Those are the threads. And if you follow them long enough, you'll find the whole truth, even if it hurts. And when you do decide for yourself how the story ends, don't let them write the last line for you. Because the sweetest revenge isn't the public spectacle or the whispered rumors or even the legal victory. It's waking up one morning, coffee in hand, looking around at the life you've built, and realizing the music is yours again, and this time, you're the only one who knows the lyrics. So if you've ever found yourself in my position wondering if your instincts are wrong, they aren't. Trust them. Protect yourself. And when the time comes, choose your moment. Because in the end, that's the real power. And that's my story. If you've ever uncovered a betrayal that changed everything, share your story below. I promise someone out there needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like mine, subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because sometimes the truth isn't just the ending, it's the whole song.